involved in this thing. So, maybe I haven't read the right article. I don't understand what happened on, Saturday. But anyway, I'm focused on the foundation and the pandemic, and if
Well, what can you say? The indicator gave us another buy signal for Japanese yen at 105,672. So I am placing an order to buy again Japanese yen at 105,672.
Facebook and think they've become too powerful. Is this an effective way to preserve competition?
Well, these companies are shaping the economy. It's the idea that congressmen get a chance to talk to their leaders and try and understand how, what they're doing in terms of media and competition. That all makes sense. They were lucky. There were 4 of them on the hot seat. I was all by myself with critics sitting next to me. So, hey, I guess we're getting nicer to CEOs than in the old days. I always felt going to Washington and talking about our values and what we did, was helpful, particularly, through this pandemic where these companies have done so well. Now understanding, what's it like to be an entrant into these markets. There's legitimate issues there that in a kind of a scattershot way did get raised.
Well, that was Bill Gates, the co-chair of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and Microsoft co-founder. Now let's get back to earnings, and Commerzbank cut its goal for full-year profit as a Wirecard scandal adds to the pandemic pain. Well, we've been speaking to the lender's chief financial officer.
Well, first of all, Q2, we have shown a profit. So that's already important. And I mean, for the full year, we said already in the Q1 announcement that it would become much more aspirational to reach a positive net income given the corona impact.
We opened new position on Japanese yen at 105,672. Okay.
Q3 or Q4 further restructuring charges to really make progress on our cost reduction program. And that all in all brings us to a negative net income for this year.
In terms of, Bettina, the Wirecard story, before you were CEO at Commerzbank, long before, journalists were writing stories about the problems at this bank, and the amount of smoke coming from the company meant pretty much everybody should have known there was fire. The regulators certainly didn't seem to wise up to that until far too late. Neither did the government. What do you think needs to change so that we don't have another case where a German DAX company, misplaces more than 2 billion euros?
I mean, the discussion is ongoing, and I will clearly not comment on single cases from our side. But what I can say as a general thing is that clearly, I mean, one is the question on how do you regulate, for example, payments providers, and that is something which needs to be discussed by regulator and politicians. And on the other side, I think everybody has to ask who is involved in cases like that. What have been the red flags, and have we dealt correctly with the red flags which were out there? And that is something which will happen over the next weeks and months, I'm pretty sure.
Well, that was the Commerzbank Chief Financial Officer, Bettina Orlopp. Now, coming up, Disney gets down to business. The entertainment giant tops earnings estimates and plans an online debut for its live-action remake of Mulan. We have the details next. This is Bloomberg.
climate change is the defining issue of our time, so we've redefined how we cover it. With clear data and rigorous journalism, we rise to the scale of the challenge to reveal the breadth of possibility. We look at stories from every angle to provoke debate, spotlight solutions, and make sense of the greatest crisis of our generation. Bloomberg Green, solutions for a changing climate.
It is critically important that the markets stay open in this time, as opposed to trying to take breaks in the middle. I think that that'll just push off the situation a little bit, but actually could create other pent-up issues if you do close the markets.
Economics, finance, politics. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. I'm Francine Lacquet here in London. Now, BP has slashed its dividend for the first time in a decade, and the virus upended its oil business. Well, we spoke to the oil giant's chief executive, Bernard Looney.
We had a strong quarter, a very strong quarter. I think we called it an exceptional quarter in trading. It was one of the few highlights of the business in the second quarter. We're very fortunate to have an incredible trading organization that's global. I don't think that level of performance is rateable. The second quarter was probably one of the most challenging quarters in our industry's history. And it played well in a market where there was a contango. It played to people who have deep capabilities like we do. It plays to people who have infrastructure positions like we do. So a very strong quarter, but not one that we would expect to be repeated.
All right, fair. What I also was struck with yesterday is when you guys were talking about returns, and this brings into account commodity prices, is that by your own admission, you basically say that power projects make a lower return for oil and gas investments, but overall you still see higher returns of 12 to 14%. How much of that, though, is 100% predicated on, say, $60 oil, and what happens if we stay at 45?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, yesterday we laid out that the distribution policy and our commitment to shareholders has sort of three elements to it. Number one, committed distributions, which is a reset dividend and a commitment to do share buybacks. The second is profitable growth, which is the returns growth that you mentioned, as well as EBITDA per share growth. And the third is around sustainable value, where we're actually saying, here's an opportunity to invest in a company that is decarbonizing and helping the world decarbonize. On returns, I think in the early part of this decade, it's driven very much by our existing hydrocarbon business. As we head into the second half of the decade, you will see that those new businesses come to the fore. We're optimistic about what we can do in this space. We've said that we expect to go from about 2.5 gigawatts of power to 50 gigawatts. We've talked also, it's not just about renewables, it's about the consumer and the mobility into the business, which we said yesterday is probably in the region, Alex, of 15 to 20% return. So our transition story is not just a renewable energy story, it is also a consumer story, it is also a mobility story. And, you know, people may not know, BP sells coffee. We sold 150 million cups of coffee last year. That's a third as much as Costa does. This is a very strong business. It's a growth business. We're going to go from 10 million customer touch points a day to 20 million over the next decade. So we're as excited about that as we are about the low carbon energy part.
But Bernard, don't you still need $60 oil to make all that happen? Because you need the cash flows from your oil and gas assets to make all this work.
So what we did, Alex, with the distribution policy reset is what we wanted to do is consistent with strategy. And this decision was rooted in strategy, absolutely rooted in strategy. We want to become an integrated energy company. We need to invest into the transition. To do that, we want to be able to do it at a range of prices. And what we set out yesterday is a framework, a financial framework that has a balance point of $40 oil. So we can do these things at $40 oil. And by the way, if oil is less than $40, we will take actions to preserve that. So what we've laid out is a very resilient distribution policy that enables us to invest into the transition while giving shareholders a fixed dividend and the potential for at least 60% of buybacks if there is excess cash flow.
Well, that was the BP Chief Executive, Bernard Looney, speaking with our Alex Steele. Now, Disney is leaning even harder on its streaming business. In its earnings call, the entertainment giant announced that Mulan will go straight to Disney Plus, and also announced that the launch of a new international TV service. Joining us to discuss all of this is Danny Berger. Hi, good morning, Danny. What is Disney's strategy with actually expanding its streaming offering?
Good morning, Francine. So this definitely does seem like a shift in strategy, and it's one that's really preparing Disney for a new world where people are traveling less to go to theme parks and likely not visiting cinemas as much either. Now, theme parks still the core of their business, but just anecdotally, what we've heard is that they have a lot of impressive safety measures. The Mulan move is certainly an interesting one because there had been hesitation from Disney to launch this on streaming services instead of straight to theaters. But again, this really shows they know that the world is changed. Perhaps that change will continue. Their CEO, Bob Chapek, did say, view this as a one-off, but at least for now. They're going to charge $30 to see Mulan along with the charge of having Disney Plus. And if it works well, don't be surprised if Disney continues to make moves like this, continues to release movies to their streaming services. They've also said that Star, it's a TV package that they acquired when they bought 21st Century Fox based in India. They're going to take that internationally as well. And it's clear investors like this move. Shares moved as high as 5.5% higher after the announcement that they would make this change, focusing on streaming, Francine.
Disney also posted a surprise profit in the quarter. What drove their earnings down?
Well, we definitely saw that the coronavirus drove their earnings down. They had a big hit from the closure of theme parks, but what really helped them post that profit was lower sports fees for their services like ESPN and ABC. They got to defer some of those payments in order to show the sports games. So they didn't have that this quarter, and that helped them post the profit, Francine.
Thank you so much, our Danny Berger there with the very latest on some of the Disney figures and challenges ahead. Now, Bloomberg surveillance continues. Tom King joins me out of New York. We'll have a lot to talk about. We'll be talking with, well, later today, actually, we get the latest on the pandemic with Dr. Anthony Fauci. And ahead of that, we look at the economy. This is Bloomberg.
Another day of risk off across the financial markets. We bring you special coverage of all the price action and implications here on Bloomberg Television.
Beirut is rocked by a massive explosion at its main port, killing at least 100 and injuring thousands. Authorities are yet to confirm what caused the blast. Commerzbank cut its outlook. The German lender abandons its goal for a full-year profit as the Wirecard scandal adds to the pandemic pain. And Disney leans into streaming. As the pandemic threatens the entertainment giant's traditional businesses, it plans to release Mulan on Disney+. Well, good morning, everyone. This is Bloomberg Surveillance. Tom and Francine from London and New York. Tom, we'll spend quite a lot of time looking at the Disney business model to try and understand exactly what that means going forward. As less people go to theme parks and stay in more, I guess the only thing they can do is to try and bet more on their streaming service.
No, it's a pandemic model. It was a really interesting call yesterday. And, of course, there's the splash over Mulan and technology and all that. One of our producers, she's going to buy it 7 times. $29 a hit, and Tania's going to see it. It's going to be like $180 the first day when she gets Mulan. But to me, it was a real pandemic overlay, Francine. This is serious stuff, and you can bring it right over to the urgency in Washington on the stimulus, where yesterday, just as everyone predicted, there was a panic, and maybe they've jump-started those talks.
Yeah, so we look at stimulus. Just so you know, Tom, a subscription model is that you actually buy for Disney Plus and you don't have to buy the movie each time. I think that's how it works. But
okay.
I know we'll have, the experts on that. The other thing that's going on is not only stimulus, but it's, of course, what's going on with Lebanon with that horrific explosion. And economically, Lebanon was already on its knees, and this will just push it further into difficult territory. So I know we'll have a full roundup of some of the emerging markets. Now let's get straight to the Bloomberg First Word News in New York City. Here's Ritika Gupta. Hi, Ritika.
Morning, Francine. Tom, as you were discussing, the pictures are incredibly intense. That explosion at a warehouse in Beirut was felt miles away, and it filled the city's hospitals with casualties. Reports are at least 100 people were killed and some 4,000 injured. Lebanon's government says that almost 3,000 tons of flammable ammonium nitrate had been stored in the building since 2014, but they're not saying whether the blast was caused by an accident or an attack. The White House and Democrats are trying to strike a deal on virus relief legislation by the end of the week. That's according to Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin. Mnuchin says the two sides aren't close to a deal yet, but they did agree to set a timeline. One of the main sticking points is still the extension of supplemental unemployment benefits. It will be the highest level visit to Taiwan by a U.S. cabinet official since 1979. And it's seen as a challenge to China. Health and Human Services Secretary Alex Azar will arrive in Taipei in the coming days to discuss the global response to the coronavirus. Taiwan's response to the outbreak has been widely recognized as amongst the most effective in the world. In the UK, a panel of lawmakers has issued a report that is scathing about the way Prime Minister Boris Johnson's government handled the coronavirus. It urged Johnson to be more open with the British people on travel risks. And it said the March 13 lifting of all restrictions on the movements of people arriving in the UK was inexplicable. Global news 24 hours a day on air and at Bloomberg Quick Take, powered by more than 2,700 journalists and analysts in more than 120 countries. I'm Ritika Gupta. This is Bloomberg. Francine, Tom.
Ritika, thanks so much. On equities, bonds, currencies, commodities, it's a really, really interesting day to check on a Wednesday, into claims tomorrow and the jobs day on Friday. Yeah, futures are up. We've seen this lift. NASDAQ leading the way, etc. The VIX comes in with a vengeance. This is a big deal, 23.13 on the VIX. We'll see how that settles out in the next hours. Yields plunging yesterday and coming back today, but still setting here with much lower yields from where we were a few weeks ago. That 10-year tips we talk a lot about comes in ever more. In gold, Francine, I can't afford it.
Yeah, no one can afford gold. European stocks are climbing to a one-week high. If you look at gold, it's staying above $2,000 an ounce after touching a record high. I'm also looking at investors and what they're focused on with U.S.-China trade discussions. And, of course, this fact that American lawmakers are making a bit of progress on this economic aid package. That's giving...
I'm placing stop on profit for Japanese yen at 105.692. 105.692. Okay, stop on profit placed.
to reach an overall agreement if we can get one by the end of this week. Well, joining us now is Paul Donovan. He's UBS Wealth Management Global Chief Economist. Paul, great to speak to you as always. Are we going to get a deal? Are we going to get a meaningful deal?
Well, I think a deal is quite likely. I mean, after all, it's in both sides' political interests. You don't want to be the political party being blamed for weakening the economic bounce back, because that's what's going to happen. If we don't get some kind of deal which offers some additional support to the millions of Americans who are currently unemployed, then the economic bounce back is going to be severely compromised. So I think that it is in the interest of both parties. They're taking it right to the last minute, but that's politics for you. So I do think that some kind of deal is likely.
I mean, a deal that would include what, Paul? What does it actually mean for the U.S. economy? Are there going to be blind spots?
So, I mean, one of the problems we've had right from the start with the pandemic is there's a trade-off between efficient policy and quick policy. So you could have a perfectly crafted, really efficient, really targeted piece of policy, but if it's not there quickly enough, if you're not getting the assistance through to the economy in a speedy fashion, then it's going to be useless because the economy will have collapsed while you're dithering around. So what I think we really need to focus on here is something to deal with the unemployment benefit, because this drop in unemployment benefit that we've had since last week, from $1,000 a week to $400 a week in round numbers, that is cataclysmic. It's really, really damaging, obviously, if you're unemployed. But from a macroeconomic sense, if you are in work, but you're afraid you're going to lose your job, and you see the consequences of losing your job being $400 a week, not $1,000 a week, that's going to change the behavior of millions more who are in work, but who are afraid. And that's the real thing we've got to address as quickly as possible.
Paul, where are we within the continuum of austerity? I mean, you've done such a good job over the years of gauging austerity across Europe and such. I mean, basically, there's a thrust of American politics that wants some austerity, hugely concerned about deficits. Where are we on the austerity meter?
So we're not, I think, going to be contemplating austerity for a while. What we would have recognized is this is an extraordinarily severe crisis, but it is also hopefully a relatively short-lived crisis, because fear, which is what's driving the economic damage, does fade over time. People do adapt. I've always said this, we always underestimate how good people are at adapting in the face of adversity. And that's what people are doing. They're adapting. So even though US caseloads are going up, the economic reaction, the fear, is less than it was, say, 2 or 3 months ago. And that's the benefit. So it's a short-lived problem. So I think what we have to regard this as is a sort of a step change increase in government debt levels, a one-off increase. That doesn't require austerity. It requires long-term planning, but it doesn't require sort of a shock of austerity to deal with it.
Really, really important insight. Paul Donovan, does that bring over to a step decrease in yield? I mean, can you take the steppiness, the discontinuous sense of it, right over to the market into yields?
So the problem we've got here, of course, is that alongside the increase in debt, you're also seeing an increase in financial repression. So I'm often asked, what's giving the right signal?
We closed another position in Japanese yen at 105,692. We have 200 pounds in profit on this one.
Central bank manipulation, it's reflecting interest rate expectations, and that's a whole different set of policies. Effectively, financial repression is acting as a new form of taxation, fairly discrete form of taxation, but it's there. The equity market, of course, represents a tiny subsection of the economy, and it's the part of the economy that's least affected by the COVID-19 crisis. It's your local mom and pop store. It's the beauty salon or the hairdressers. Not that I know much about hairdressers. It's the local bar. Those are the companies or the businesses that are most negatively affected. They're not represented in the equity market.
So, Paul, what's your biggest concern about scarring of the U.S. economy? Is it companies going bust? Is it, and does that lead to, to employment? How do you measure it? What's the one metric that will give us a shock to the downside in 3 months?
So I think the issue here is that we've got obviously a large number of people who are temporarily unemployed. We need to make sure that that temporary does mean temporary. So we want to stop good businesses failing unnecessarily. That's always been one of the #1 objectives. But at the end of this process, we are going to have some good businesses that have failed unnecessarily. And we are also accelerating structural change. The fourth industrial revolution's been accelerated. Issues around environmental sustainability, the environmental credit crisis.